Okay, we looks like we have a small group, but I want to thank you for taking the time to join us for this presentation. If you don't know me personally, my name is Carlos Jimenez. I'm the assistant manager of writing support here for the GSEP. I work with Regina Meister, and we both help all of the graduate students in education and psychology with any writing issues that you may have. If it's APA format, if it's writer's block, you're doing research, anything that we can help you with, we are available. Our email addresses are there in the chat box, just in case for your reference. Also, there is our community page, community.pepperdine.edu. And if you go on that page and if you follow the links to student services and the writing support link, there are a number of references, number of resources there for you to look at your own convenience. Some of these materials here in this presentation are there as well. So I'll start with just a brief overview of this presentation, this webinar. Basically, we'll be talking about the beginnings of scholarly writing. We'll look at some samples of two pieces of work and somewhat analyze them to see the strengths and the weaknesses in both pieces. We'll look a little bit at introductions and overviews, thesis statement, issues like tone, and addressing the naive audience. So first of all, let's take a look at some examples here. Both have to do with this trust. So just to give you a little background, let me see if I can make this larger. Okay, and if for any reason you can't see something or you have a question, like I said before, feel free to chime in. You can unmute your mic and speak, or you can type in the chat box. So this was an assignment for EDOL, I believe, the ed side. And the assignment was basically an article analysis. You were to read an article, discuss the ideas. There were two choices. You could explain whether or not they applied the concepts on trust in the workplace, or you could read and summarize the article and respond whether you agreed or not, and why or why not. So let's go first to what we titled the good sample. Actually, let's start with, okay, we'll start with the good. If I could ask maybe if Margarita or Neil, would you like to just read the first page aloud? Would that be possible if one of you could do that?
I'm here. Carlos, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Margarita. It seems
Okay.
Neil cannot.
Okay. So you want me to go ahead and read it?
Let's wait 1 minute, see if Neil can get back on. Maybe Neil lost audio. Let's see if maybe he can try logging out and back in. Since there are only two of us, let's see if we can get Neil
Okay.
back on.
Okay.
Sorry for the wait, but let's see. Let's see. Let's see, Neil, can you hear us? You might be going back out and going back in again. Okay, we may have Neil back. Can you hear us, Neil?
Yeah, looks like I'm back in again. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, Margarita, would you like to just briefly read this first page on the sample of Rethinking Trust?
Sure.
Thank you.
Rethinking Trust, a review and application. Trust is a topic that has received considerable attention in the midst of recent bailouts and corporate scandals. A plethora of publications have been released on the topic of trust and how it impacts consumer confidence, employee engagement, and the economy. Despite this reality, in his article, Rethinking Trust, Kramer, 2009, asserts that most individuals are still too trusting and must learn how to temper this trust in order to avoid exploitation and ensure survival. According to Kramer, humans are predisposed to trust both biologically and socially, and often ignore or downplay any discrepancies or evidence of untrustworthy behavior. In his article, he outlines 7 basic rules or principles that must be followed in order to learn how to trust more wisely. According to Kramer 2009, Rule 1 for trusting wisely involves knowing yourself and whether your natural inclination as an individual is to be more prone to trusting people or more inclined to have difficulty cultivating trusting relationships. Research has shown that the default position for most individuals is to be trusting across a wide range of social situations unless they have been a victim of a significant violation of trust. In our interaction with others in a work environment, it is important to assess the level of trust that exists among individuals by observing the dynamics of our interactions. For example, in the nonprofit organization where I work, JA Worldwide, the majority of projects are large in scope and involve multiple players across different departments. Over time, I have learned that the level of trust among individual members of a cross-functional team can determine the success or the failure of the project. Individuals who are too trusting tend to assume that everyone has completed their work on their project and that every member will put 100% of their time and effort to achieve the overall program objectives. Although this positive attitude is refreshing, these individuals often become
Okay, go ahead and just continue that
okay,
sentence. It's at the top.
frustrated when other team members are not as conscientious with deadlines or disengage or are too lenient when individual team members are not fulfilling their obligations.
All right, thank you. So that is the first sample, and we'll get into to identifying some elements that make it scholarly or not. Let's look at the next one, um, which is a little bit. It's the same article, I believe, but it's a different assignment. They were choosing whether to agree or disagree, and why or why not. And maybe Neil, do you think you'd be able to read that first page aloud for us?
Yeah, I think so. So, Spotlight on
Okay,
Trust.
thank you.
In his article, Spotlight on Trust, Kramer, June 2009, states that people were born to trust. At infancy, we learn love and warmth and thus begin our journey of security. Kramer believes that although people experience downfalls in things or individuals they have trusted, people still bounce back and trust again. For example, Madoff took advantage of a lot of people, yet someone else will come along later and still manage to deceive our society again. As we'll explore later on in my analysis, I totally disagree with Kramer based on experiences. I believe that we remember our experiences vividly and eventually will not trust again. Although we make certain transactions that may seem comfortable looking from the outside, we are always wondering, what if, of distrust. Roderick starts his article with a quote: "Despite deceit, greed, and incompetence on a previously unimaginable scale, people are still. I believe that people have become immune to not trusting individuals. After a while, one learns to just go along with the program. You do your work, communicate, and even politically associate, but always have your guards up and watch your own back. A good example is what just happened last week when President Obama was called a lie by one of the senators. Obama realizes that some people just do not like him for whatever reason. However, when he was asked to comment on the matter, he stated that it was no big deal, and he does not believe the senator meant any harm. Obama has another agenda, and he is not trying to lose focus by saying what he really feels about the situation. Healthcare is his priority. Do you believe that he will ever believe or trust this senator? Certainly not. But he will communicate and do business as if nothing has ever happened. That is not a sign of trust.
Okay, that's good there. Thank you both for volunteering for reading. So let's. It might be fairly obvious, we see one paper is stronger than the other, but what would you notice? Any scholarly elements in the works? Obviously, one seems more scholarly than the other. Correct?
Agreed. I think
Yes.
the first one. Yep.
The Rethinking Trust, right? So let's start with the weak one, however. So what elements do you see here? You can either type in or you can speak. I guess there are only two of you here, so we can leave the mics unmuted. I don't think we'd have too much trouble with feedback. So what elements here do you see that are not scholarly? What do you notice here in this spotlight on trust in this example here? Is there anything that jumps out to you
Well,
that seems
there's no real introduction into what the person is thinking. It just goes right into what the article states.
good? Good. There's not a solid background intro. We want to start, especially in our opening paragraph, kind of like a funnel. We want to start with some broad concepts and narrow them rather than jumping right into to analyzing the article. Correct. Correct. Anything else that catches your attention here?
Well, geez, this is Neil. Where to begin? It's pretty much all over the board. I mean, there's references to Madoff that he doesn't have referenced, quotes of what if, which is probably okay, and distrust, but I have a feeling that that's really not very scholarly in that first paragraph.
Exactly. It is very scattered. That's a good point there. It's very scattered, and he provides, or the writer, I don't know if he or she, but the writer provides examples without giving context.
Mm-hmm.
They assume that we know who Madoff is, which we may. But however, when you're writing, one key point to remember is you want to address the audience as if they were naive, as if they don't have any knowledge about what you are referring. So whether it's the topic at hand or whether it's examples, it's important to provide the writer with some background, the readers, I'm sorry, with some background or context before jumping into these examples. Good.
It
So
also
there,
seems to be a very personal, I believe, just it's more of a discussion versus a paper.
exactly the type of language. So we look at it's more of a colloquial style of language, more conversational. You can see a lot of the adjectives, totally, or a lot, or we are always wondering what if, watch your own back, have your guards up. So a lot of that colloquial language we really want to avoid when we are writing in an academic paper. Not so much as conversational, but more on an academic level. Good. Anything else here that we see?
Well, he's got references to, like, Roddick starts his article without any kind of reference. I think it's in the second paragraph.
Exactly. Roderick starts his article with a quote. Exactly. So he's not. So the writer is not setting up the paragraphs in an effective manner. He's not introducing a solid topic sentence, then going into examples or analyzing the article. Good.
And there's no flow between the first paragraph, any of the paragraphs. I don't know where he's going from the last sentence in the first paragraph of there is one sign of distrust, and then we go straight into Roderick. What is that tie there? How did you jump from there to there?
Good. We don't see a sense of direction. We don't
No.
see a sense of purpose, which is really important to outline in your first paragraph. We really want to direct the reader and introduce our concepts before jumping in or noting where we are going to shift the focus of the argument before we do it. Exactly. Okay, great. So let's take a look at the strong sample here. Rethinking Trust, a review and application. So this was a little bit different in that the writer is presenting the article and they are explaining whether or not they applied these concepts on trust in the workplace. So just by this first page here, what do you notice some positive things that make this paper scholarly here? Can you see any examples?
Well, you're telling
Well,
me what
there's
trust
a general
is.
introduction. Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Margarita.
I said, well, you're telling me what trust is and how you're going to explain it and use it.
Good. So there's a solid uh, definition for the most part in the first paragraph, and there's an explanation outlining these rules or principles of trust. And if you look throughout the rest of the paper, each paragraph addresses each of those rules. Correct. And Neil, did you have something to say?
No, I think it was pretty much the same thing. A nice transition from the article. The last sentence of the first paragraph leads the reader to assume that you're going to be typing about the next rule or the first rule.
Exactly. So that would basically be the thesis, right? He outlined
Mm-hmm.
7 basic rules or principles that must be followed in order to learn how to trust more wisely. So that is basically the thesis statement in this paper. And if you notice, in every subsequent paragraph, the writer takes each rule and explains it, then gives some examples. Good. What about some of the statements? How are they supported? Does it look like we have this person's opinion, or do they provide support for the statements that they are making?
Well, I guess it's a little bit yes and no on this one. I mean, he says, according to Kramer, again, he's just referencing, or he or she is referencing one scholarly work, I'm assuming. I don't know what Kramer is. I'm assuming it's an article, um,
Mm-hmm.
empirical data. But it's not really, it says research has shown the deficit position from a, it's not, is that Kramer saying it? So, like, the second sentence in the second paragraph makes me wonder, on one hand, is that regarding, it's in the paragraph of Kramer, so I'm assuming Kramer has referenced that research has shown a deficit position, but that particular statement does not seem in itself to be very scholarly because it doesn't really have a very good reference. If I would have thought you would need something more building that in 2 or 3 different references.
Okay, I do see that. I understand what you're saying there. Research has shown that the default position for most individuals, there's not really solid context for that statement as
Yep.
far as what research is showing this. Maybe I believe they are just analyzing 1 or 2 articles, but it could have been more supported. Yes, if they had maybe provided some citations that outline that this research. That is a good point. That is definitely.
Yeah, and it goes further. For example, the nonprofit organization where I work, is he bringing it in, or is this Kramer saying this? So I'm not quite certain where the working with JA Worldwide is. Is that something that Kramer said, or is this a statement by the author of this paper?
Well, if we notice, usually in papers, depending on the assignment's instructions, right, we wouldn't normally use first person or second person. So in this case, the instructor might have allowed the writer to use I. So they are using personal examples to address the issues of trust in the workplace and how Kramer's ideas are reflected personally. So in this case, in the nonprofit organization where I work, JA Worldwide, that would be the writer. That would be the writer giving a personal example in that case. So they are analyzing Kramer's article and applying it to their own lives there and how it is reflected in their own workplace.
So
Okay,
yes.
and you're saying that that would make it scholarly or not so scholarly? I mean, I understand the instructor may have said that, but I would not expect to see something like that writing with that kind of I and where I work in a scholarly work. Am I wrong?
Well, it would, like I said before, it would depend on what the assignment was. Normally, we don't do that. You're correct, and we don't say you like in the other one in the
Yeah.
spotlight. We don't really use you or we, unless we are specific. We were talking about we as educators or we as future therapists or something like that. In this case, the article, the assignment was asking to be a little bit more reflective, so they are using I here. But in other cases, you're correct. In majority of the academic writing that you'll see in your classes, you wouldn't be using the first person. You wouldn't be using I or you or even you or we. You want to stay objective, having that objective voice, that tone. That's where the tone would come into play. But
So,
if you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh no, go ahead. Finish your thought.
But if you notice, I was just going to point out that each paragraph begins with presenting each rule and then an analysis of the rule. And they apply the rule to their personal life. So they are analyzing each rule in isolation within each paragraph, and then they are applying it, whether or not it's being demonstrated in their own personal workplace.
And that's what I was going to say, is that it seems like they give you the broad rule. They talk a little bit about general research, but then he applies it very specifically. So it's going that whole funnel again in each paragraph, going from the wide rule to what research is saying to narrow it down a little bit. And then it makes it very specific in his workplace and how it's affected him. So perhaps that's the application of this Rethinking Trust
Yes,
article that
definitely.
they reviewed. So that's what I'm just seeing, the wide, that a little bit more general and then very specific.
Definitely, yes. And if you notice, also there's an element of professional vocabulary, very different from the other one, the spotlight on
Yeah.
trust, where it's not a colloquial language, and they are speaking in a more academic, with solid verbs, things like asserts and tempers, and there are active sentences. A lot of times when we are writing, um, we may tend to use passive, but we want to be more active with our voice, and that will make for a more effective paper there.
So can you show me an example of that? What's an active sentence here?
An active sentence, for example, if you go to the first paragraph here, despite this reality, in his article, Kramer asserts
Assert.
that most individuals are still too trusting. Rather than say, it is asserted, it is asserted that most individuals are still in the article, it is asserted, right? But we have Kramer asserts, so we have a doer, we have an actor that is um, that is doing, rather than putting it in the passive where it is asserted or it is known, where we don't really have an active voice there. So
Okay.
when you're doing your rereading after you've done writing, a good thing is to go back and read it aloud. Read it aloud to yourself. Um, Sometimes when we read it silently, we won't always catch some of the mistakes or sentence errors that we find when we're just reading it silently, and we might skip over those things. But when we read it aloud, then sometimes we might be able to hear those things more. And if you notice some of those passive sentences, then we want to reconstruct those and rephrase them to a more active voice. Okay, let's look a little bit at this um, PowerPoint slides here on scholarly writing. So just a little bit of information on introductions. When we want to start our introductions, like I mentioned before, we want to start from broad to specific. So basically, we want to give the background of the subject, the context
Yeah, I think
within.
another example there was action with people was.
Oh, on the sample. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, Neil. Go ahead.
You know, yeah, what I was saying was in the second paragraph here. Maybe I'm just want to see if I got this right. The second paragraph, second sentence. It says research has shown. It sounds very passive to say that rather than research indicates. And then the next sentence, which I think is more active, which I think says in our interaction with others. That sounds pretty active. Is that
Yes.
kind of a difference between active and maybe passive?
Yes, research has shown. Why do you think that maybe that would have been put in the passive? So it's not always a negative to use the passive, but in some cases it is okay. Why do you think it would be okay in this case? Research has shown.
Well, I think it's okay. I don't know. Maybe it's my stickler point because I thought paragraphs with basic writing principles had to either be past, present, or future, and you never really want to mix things together. So if you're writing, whatever the first statement of the topic of the paragraph is, kind of defines whether you're talking about the past, you're talking about the present, or you're talking about the future. And in this particular case, I see some mixture here. So research has shown, that's past tense. And then in the next sentence, it's in our interaction with others, which is kind of the present tense, or could be
Okay,
passive, or at least past tense.
that's a good point, but think about the verb has shown. So the reason why they may be using this would be considered the present, almost the present perfect, right? Because you have a form of have and then you have the verb. So research has shown, instead of saying research showed. The reason why they might be using this construction is because this is research that is relevant to the present. So it was research that was done in the past, but maybe it also has present relevance. So that might be why they're using has shown, because it's not something that finished in the past. The research may still be ongoing, right? So the reason why they're using this verb tense is maybe because they're referring to something that is in the past but has present relevance. So they are saying that this research was done and is still going on in a sense when you're using the perfect has and then plus the verb. So in that case, that's why they might be using this form here, because they're indicating something in the past that is still present, that is still relevant to the present. But for the most part, they are talking about the present, right? And this person is employed in this company, so it would be the present here.
Yeah, and I can see where research has shown could be inferred as present, so that's cool.
Yeah, and because maybe also they're not pointing to any specific research, so there actually isn't a doer in this case. They're just showing that research has been done
Right.
about this topic here. But it would strengthen the paper if they could refer to some examples in a citation
Yeah.
that shows some of the evidence of this research. So that is a good point there. Okay. Um, So let's look a little bit about some of these introductions. So these are the main elements that you're providing when you are giving your introduction: the background, the context within which you'll be discussing, definition of the topic if that's necessary. A lot of times some of these concepts, especially in your particular division, if it's education, if it's psychology, and you're referring to some of these concepts, you might automatically assume that your readers will know what you're talking about. Maybe your instructor does. However, if it's important to assume that your reader has no knowledge. And it usually just takes maybe a sentence or two to give some context to the topic. If you're talking about a manic episode or schizophrenia, or maybe you're talking about an education concept like No Child Left Behind, or something that may seem like general knowledge, but you want to assume the naive audience. Okay, and usually toward the end of the first paragraph, you're going to give your thesis statement or your overview there. Okay. With your introductions, you do have a little bit more creativity, so to speak, in how you can effectively grab the reader's attention and to motivate them. You know, we'll look at some examples of some improper introductions that may mislead the reader or not really motivate the reader to want to continue. Um, it also establishes your tone. So your tone would refer to the attitude toward the subject that it comes across to the reader. So is it an objective tone or is it subjective? Do we automatically see your opinion that's evoked without evidence or support there? So we want a credible and objective tone to be established right away in the beginning of the paper. Also, rapport with the reader. Do you feel a sense of trust? Does the reader feel a sense of trust when they begin reading? Or do they just think that, this is coming from your own head and you don't have any solid support for that? Okay, and towards the end, you begin to limit the scope of the topic, and that narrows down to what your thesis statement would be there. Okay, here's an example of an introduction, and you can take a look at it. I'll go ahead and I'll read this aloud. Okay, it says, "They woof. Though I have photographed them before, I have never heard them speak, for they are mostly silent birds. Lacking a syrinx, the avian equivalent of the human larynx, they are incapable of song. According to field guides, the only sounds they make are grunts and hisses, though the Hawk Conservancy in the United Kingdom reports that adults may utter a croaking coo, and that young black vultures, when annoyed, emit a kind of immature snarl." So when you take a look at this, what do you see here after the first line here? They woof. Does the introduction kind of make you want to move on? Does it pique your interest? Obviously, this is a little bit different type of introduction. But do you see
Yeah, I think
how...
so. I think it's, they woof makes me think, wow, what woofs? And he's photographed them? You got to be kidding me. This is cool. So I want to read more.
Exactly. So in a way, the writer is using the introduction by not mentioning the subject in the opening phrase to sort of pique your interest, to encourage the reader to want to move on. So that is one element, that's one way that we can attract the reader's attention. Sort of a small vignette or a small anecdote, kind of setting up the reader to want to continue to see what the subject of the paper is. Definitely. Let's look at some examples of some ineffective introductions. So here are some examples of Some common ways that writers often use introductions, but are not very effective. The first one, according to Webster's dictionary, it's just very general. It's not, almost kind of boring, you know, doesn't really lead us very well. Also, sometimes announcing what you are going to write about, it's just very plain, doesn't really grab the attention of the reader. My assignment was to do this, you know. Um, it says, as a general rule, we want to avoid openings that comment on the writing assignment itself. A lot of times, writers like to use cliches or mixed metaphors. The APA manual really discourages against using these types of figurative language, these linguistic devices. They may sound very eloquent, but they could often mislead the reader, um, and they're very unnecessary. So you want to try to avoid using these mixed metaphors, these types of cliches here. We want to skip these announcements. You know, in this essay, I'm going to write about, you know, we want to try to avoid things like that. And also the overuse of this type of language like alliteration, you know, framed fantastically against the expansive cerulean sky was a soaring wedge of gossiping, gabbling geese. So you see, it's a little it's a little off here and unnecessary. Maybe for a different style of writing, maybe a creative writing class, but not very academic. So it is important to talk to your instructor, ask questions on what the instructor is really looking for in the assignment, and that's key um, in writing an effective paper. But for the most part, we want to avoid these types of introductions here. Okay.
Yeah, what's a shimmering cocaine
I don't know.
covered?
Regina Meister, my manager, she provided these materials. So I'm not sure where this is coming from, but a shimmering cocaine colored V haloed in sunlight must be a flock of birds. They must be white or something. But we don't really see any direction here. I mean, it's a nice poetic uh, picture, but we don't really want to start our papers that way here. So this is a little bit different style if you're doing something like a literature review, where you're going to give. You're not trying to necessarily argue or prove something, but you're going to present findings of literature, and you're ordering them in a meaningful way to your reader. Um, and you're going to conclude what the literature is saying rather than argue the point and researching literature that agrees with your point. So this is a little bit different organization if you're doing something like a literature review. Um, so if you notice these two examples, the first one, maybe it needs a little bit more specificity. While effective teachers plan and prepare, they also have the intuitive ability to improvise when required, an ability most recently referred to as pedagogical abandon. Um, and the other one, the literature is organized into the following sections: bereavement, meaning, and growth. So they are um, using the literature to drive the main focus, and basically the literature is informing the thesis. So they're using, also, you make sure you want to use recent scholarly peer-reviewed articles when you're doing your research, and try to find some themes that you can relate each of these articles together, right? You want to try to find maybe about 3 or 4 major themes that you find when you're doing your research among all of the articles um, and work that you are looking at. One other method that is effective when you're doing your writing to make sure that your ideas are being followed in a logical flow is using this hook and eye technique. Are either of you familiar with the hook and eye technique? Have you heard of that before?
I am not.
No?
Very long
So,
time ago, but I could use a refer.
okay, very long time ago. Great. So the hook and eye technique, basically it's a way that you can follow your paper and get an idea of how your sentences are relating to one another. If you look at this sample here and you follow the circled words here, you can see in almost every sentence here, the subject or the focus of the paper is being highlighted. So first we have they. They sit in the back room, not because they want to, but because it was the place designated to them. Well, who are they? Well, we find out in the next sentence, right? Invisible barriers that exist in most classrooms divide the room and separate the students. So they would refer to students. Okay, so and if you follow each sentence, you see that that the students or the subject is being addressed throughout the entire introduction and mostly throughout the paper here. So that is one technique when you are going back and doing your revision to make sure that your ideas are connected and they're flowing in a logical manner, is to try this hook and eye technique with your writing. And if you notice that some of maybe one or two of your sentences um, doesn't address doesn't address the topic or the subject at hand, then maybe it's out of place or maybe it needs to be rephrased or eliminated completely. So this is one technique that you can use when you're doing your revision to make sure that you are following your ideas and your ideas are connected in a logical manner. Okay, so we see here it starts with students, then it goes specifically to athletes, but then as it shifts a little bit as it goes further down, it starts talking about research. Okay, then the next paragraphs talk about research and problems and reform. Then it goes back to the students. Okay, so we want to make sure that our ideas are all aligned together as we are presenting them in our writing. Okay, one last handout here is a checklist here that you can use when you're going back and doing your revisions here. And I believe I sent this to you in your email, so you should have this. Um, so some things that you can look at and ask while you're doing your revision. Do you have um, a solid introduction that begins broadly and then narrows to the main point, somewhat of a funnel? Is the thesis statement clear? Does it provide a blueprint or a layout for the rest of the paper? Your tone, is it objective? What is the attitude toward the subject? Avoiding this type of language, emotional language, the colloquial language and slang. One good thing is to use a thesaurus. Use a thesaurus with you. If you notice you are using the same adjectives or verbs over and over again, see if there's some way where you can vary the word choice, vary the diction. And that could be a little bit difficult because you want to make sure that you understand the words that you are using. And sometimes, maybe for a non-native English speaker or even some that doesn't use the type of academic language so often, they might try to force themselves to use these words, but they might be using them ineffectively or they're not really sure or confident with the language. So that is one area where you need to balance that. But I would recommend having a thesaurus on hand. Now I think Microsoft Word you can do it right in the paper as you're writing. You can check for synonyms and things like that. You want to avoid words unless otherwise directed by your instructor. You want to avoid I, you, and we, especially in the research papers. Um, Avoiding wordy and passive sentences, things like that. The idea is making sure the ideas are connected. That's where you can use that hook and eye technique to make sure you have effective coherence there. Having topic sentences, that's obviously a key. You want to make sure that your topic sentence is more of a general statement that sets up the rest of the sentences within within each paragraph, and the rest of those sentences have to refer back to the topic sentence. Transitions, always effective. We have on our community page, community.pepperdine.edu, there are some handouts there with some examples of effective transition statements, depending on how you are connecting your ideas. If you're comparing them, if it's more cause and effect, things like that, you want to insert those effective transitions before switching topics or connecting the ideas. Okay, so there are some other things here that you can refer to, kind of like a checklist here, um, when you're doing your revisions, and this will definitely better, help you to write a more effective academic paper here. Okay. Um, so that's about it that we have here for today. Um, if you have any questions, you can always set up an appointment with us if you want to come in. I'm based in the West LA campus. I come to Irvine once a week, every Monday from about 9 to 6, and I also visit the Malibu and Encino campuses monthly. So if you ever would like to discuss some of these issues more in depth, or if you have a sample of something that you are working on and you'd like some feedback for some support, we can definitely help you with that. You can set up an appointment by emailing me, or you can email Regina, or we can also do things. We can do things electronically. I have Skype. We can set up a Skype session even on the phone, or we can use email correspondence. A lot of the students send. I think Margarita, you've sent me some papers too through email, right? So I use the track changes feature in Microsoft Word, so we can provide comments and highlights for revision that way. But it's always better to be in person. I find that more effective. You can explain some of these things more in more detail rather than just providing comments. But it all depends on your schedule and when you are available. But most of the time, I am here in West LA from Tuesday through Friday from about 9:30 to 6:30. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Neil and Margarita. Thank you for joining me today, and um, I hope to maybe see you in one of the next webinars that we are having. I think there's one on Wednesday, which deals with APA format, more
Oh,
specifically electronic sources. So we know a lot of the research that we are doing now, everything is retrieved online. So this is just some information on how to effectively cite and reference your electronic sources in your paper. So that's coming up Wednesday, and we have a few others in the month of March. So be looking at checking your email for some reminders on those. And if you'd like to join any of those, feel free to email me to RSVP.
I think I already
I think
did for
Margarita,
that one. Yeah.
I think maybe
Okay.
Neil too. Okay.
Yeah, I
Great.
think I'm in the next one for sure. But this is
Okay.
very nice. Thank you very much, Carlos. It's
Okay.
very nice of you to do this.
All right. Thank
Okay.
you. And thank you
Okay.
for joining.
Good to
Okay.
Have
hear
a
you,
Thank
nice
you,
day.
Carlos.
Margarita. Are you been okay?
I'm sorry. Yeah,
I said,
doing
good to
well.
hear you. Are you okay? Good.
I'm doing very well. Thank you. So,
Excellent.
and you?
Yeah, so far I just got this cold. I'm sorry I
Uh,
had to keep kind of putting my my speaker in and out because I kept coughing and I didn't want to cough on you guys. So my apologies.
No problem. Thank you for
Car-
joining. I appreciate
okay.
it.
All right,
Okay.
All
guys.
Thank you.
right.
All right.
You
Bye
have a
Thanks.
bye.
nice day. Bye
Cheers.
bye.
Bye bye.